Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Whoa, my voice is. Ladies, gentlemen. Some of these handsome young men's voices are changing, but my voice is still different than theirs, right, Jaden? So when you hear my voice, what are you supposed to do there, Isaac? Quiet down. Okay, so hopefully this works. We got a new toy here where. Now, I think in our trial run, it looks backwards right now, right? But I think in our trial run, it actually was working. So now here's the idea. If you miss class and you're doing what you're supposed to do when you miss, right, Verity? Verity, what's the protocol these days when you can't make it to school? What are you supposed to do? No, not just that. What are you supposed to do, Emily, when you miss class these days? You watch it. You actually don't ever really have to miss class anymore. The video is uploaded, and hopefully that works close to 100% of the time. So now we're hoping your experience when you do that, because there's been a lot of complaints about, hey, the screen, it goes in and out of focus. I can't really see the notes. Could you send me the notes? The audio gets messed up too. Hopefully that's not the case anymore. And hopefully, like right now, those people that are taking the class remotely are hearing us and seeing things a lot more clearly. So let's get back at it. Happy New Year. Has anybody written 2022 yet anywhere?
Yep.
Okay, here we go. Let's get back into it. Some of you forgot. If someone was to ask you on Friday, what are you studying in history? You would have probably looked at them with a blank face and said, oh, Dave would have said you would have remembered. Would you remember? You would. You probably wouldn't remember.
Yes.
But that's what we're doing, right? All right. To bring back, ladies and gentlemen, to bring things back into perspective, quick look at the vocab again. Remember this whole era coming out of the of World War I, that we want to just return to normalcy. And the president that's leading that actually used that as his campaign slogan, was the president that was elected right after the 19th Amendment, Warren G. Harding. And remember the old bad joke, Elise, that about Warren G. Harding getting elected after the 19th Amendment? Because what was the 19th Amendment, Jaden? I always pick on Jaden for this, because I remember her out. Does everybody remember Jaden's 5th grade speech meet presentation? Wasn't that awesome? Sojourner Truth. Women's suffrage, and that handsome Warren G. Harding winning that election. That's a bad joke. All right, and then also remember this: during World War I, what country just kind of 70 years, we wouldn't think of them as an ally, but back then Russia had a civil war, and the Bolsheviks took over Russia, and there was a fear in America, especially it's kind of tied to the progressive era at that time, loosely tied. There'll be another Red Scare. I think I mentioned to you after World War II, but there was a Red Scare because there was a fear that this Bolshevism was going to spread our culture. So we had to deal with that. We dealt with after the war, Americans were like, hey, can we just focus on ourselves now? Remember that most didn't want to get involved in that war anyway, and now that we did and it's over, let's start to look more inward. Let's take care of America. Kind of sounds familiar 100 years later, doesn't it? There's a big push today for, America first. Let's focus on our situation. Why are we so involved in foreign external affairs, as George Washington warned in his farewell address? Anyway, got to go quicker. Of this group in the 1920s, they were pretty much subdued and almost extinct from when all the prosecutions took place in the 1870s, but they have risen again, and now they're not just targeting blacks, which was their main focus in the South. Now they are targeting Catholics and Jews and immigrants. So there was this, again, history repeats itself, but it's different. There was this animosity about all of these immigrants coming to America, and there was a surge of immigrants, especially from Southern or Southeastern Europe. And how's that going to change our culture? There were people that were really concerned about, and you see I have this up here again today. A couple weeks ago, I put that up there. Anybody remember what it stands for? Didn't I have that up there a few weeks ago? A WASP. Are you a WASP? I'm a WASP. Many of you are WASPs. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The KKK, another thing about them, well, we'll get to them later, because they're really a hate group, but a lot of them, pun intended, cloak themselves in Christianity. We have a rise in fundamentalism, which we'll get to today. All of these terms, from prohibition and speakeasies and the flappers, we talked a lot about them. Very important, this, 100 years later, this was the first time in American culture where there was the black culture was brought into entertainment, music. I mean, dominates the music scene today, right? Was kind of like in the shadows before the 1920s. That happened in problems we talked about after the war. This interesting ratio that I think it was Jake correctly discerned that it looks like it favors America, but in actuality, it was a concession by America. After the war, hey, we just had a war because of all of this nationalism and militarism. Remember those things? And how are we going to make sure this doesn't happen again? Well, people need to tone down. Germany and United States and Great Britain and France, tone down your desire to be better military in a military sense than everybody else. So let's come together as a world and have this agreement that we're going to limit naval power. And we looked at it like, wait, how's the United States and Great Britain get 5 where Japan, France, and Italy, Japan gets 3 and the other 2 get only 1? What? That sounds like very unfair, slanted towards America and Great Britain. But we correctly looked at it a little deeper and said, actually, the resources that Great Britain already had, the greatest navy in the world at that time, and the United States had built, that was actually the United States and Great Britain agreeing to limit their production. Does that make sense? And their ability to build a superior navy. Again, we wanted to become more isolated. There's this protectionism going on. But could we be totally isolated? No. First of all, remember they owed us $22 billion. We want our money back. And then we talked about how that situation after the treaty that ended war, problems for Germany and is not a reason for the rise of a person like Hitler in World War II. Tell me where we left off. Why was it roaring? Because technology changes a lot in your lifetime, but it's not as pronounced as it was in the 1920s, because your technology is going from an iPhone 8 to an iPhone, what is it now? 12? 13? Wow. So that's technology is constantly changing, and things are quote unquote improving or getting better, faster, more efficient. But It's not as pronounced as it was then, going from using a washboard and spending probably the whole day just to do laundry to, hey, put it in the machine. And the machine washes it. Not only that, the new machines that were coming out in the 20s, they had spin cycle. So they were practically almost dry when you hung them on the line. You thought I was going to say put them in the dryer, didn't you? When you hung them on the line. So the changes that were happening in the 20s were very pronounced changes in people's lifestyle. But then we touched on this too. With all of the good things that were happening, quote unquote, or advances in technology, there were things happening in our culture that were not so good. This is an era where we have the idea of having idols. You know, the TV show is going to come 100 years later or 80 years later, but this whole idea of having people that we would go and watch and pay money to see, relatively new thing. Besides like the traveling circus or something, or carnivals. People like Jack Dempsey, a world champion boxer, the first time in history where he had an event where he was boxing and they got $1 million at the gate. That's a big deal even today, really. There's a lot of events, I'm sure, that take place and they don't get $1 million for people to pay to get in. Everybody knows Babe Ruth, but most of you probably never heard of this guy. This guy rivaled Babe Ruth back then. College football was a bigger deal than professional football. Of course, baseball was a bigger deal than all of them. That's why it's called America's pastime. Although now it's been supplanted because of the television era and how fast our society has become a pastoral game like baseball. You know, what's the big baseball today? What are they trying to do? Trying to speed it up, right? Every time you hear about news about, hey, what can we change about baseball? We want to see more home runs, more offense, more excitement, more action. Make the game not take 3 or 3.5 hours because people's attention spans today. Football is like ready-made for TV. So since television and football and television kind of grew together through the 60s, even though I hate to say this, but football's kind of taken over as America's pastime. When you say? You've got probably never heard of Bobby Jones. Became a golf legend. If you never heard of the Masters tournament, you're a golfer. You heard of the Masters, right?
Yeah.
William Tilden, the tennis star, Charlie Chaplin. I think we did watch this video, right? Charlie Chaplin and Rudy Valentino and the silent movies. Yes? Other notable people of the 20s. I think we're getting close to where we left off. Lucky Lindy, Charles Lindbergh. And did you finish that book?
No.
First non-stop solo flight. We did watch that video, but I think this is where we left off. True? No?
We left off at the network.
Okay. Al Capone, the most notorious mobster probably of all time. Does anybody know his nickname? What was Al Capone's nickname? When he was young, he got in a scrap with somebody and they cut his cheek with a blade a couple times. So he got the nickname Scarface. Valentine's Day Massacre. Did Al Capone kill anybody on Valentine's Day? No. He would never do that. He had other people to do that for him, right? And the feds were after him for years and they could never nail him, right? When you're going to take someone to court, you want to make sure that you can prove they did it, right? Well, every time they would arrest him and think they had him, you know, his lawyers, he had the most expensive lawyers. He had all the money that, you know, he could ever need. So he would always find a way legally to not have to go to court to face any charges like having people killed or even the bootlegging. So what often happens is he's not the only one this happened to. So they couldn't get him on anything else, so they got him on tax charges. And that's with them in jail. Did we see that video? I don't think so. And when I tried to play the second period, it didn't work. So I'll try to get it fixed and do it tomorrow. So we got to move on. This is a big deal for a couple reasons. First of all, it's a horrible crime. Secondly, it is an example of where the culture was in the 20s as it relates to America wanting to be like more isolated, focus on ourselves, not only not get involved in foreign affairs, but try to keep America, in their words, America. And if you allow all of these immigrants, these foreign people in, how's that going to change American culture? What effect's that going to have if we have millions of people coming from, say, Italy? Are they going to assimilate? You know what that word means? Are they going to learn English? Are they going to, when in Rome, do as the Romans do? Are they going to assimilate into being an American, or are they going to try to change America? So Sacco and Vanzetti, this case became nationwide. It was in Massachusetts. They were accused of and found guilty of killing 2 people in Massachusetts. This is at a time when there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, especially towards Italians. Any Italians in here? Okay. Does any Italians know of people in your family or your extended family that their last name isn't what their last name was when their family first came over? Because they would try to avoid being stigmatized because their last name sounded Italian. There's a lot of Italians that the name that they have today wasn't the name of their family 100 years ago or more, because there was a fear of being, Sacco and Vanzetti, pretty clear when this was hitting the headlines. See what happens when you let all these foreigners in, these people from Italy. So the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American, by the way, these Italians are also Catholic. A lot of them, right? I grew up in Latonia. A lot of Italian Catholics. I said we'd talk more about this. The KKK, a hate group, pun intended, cloaking themselves in Christianity, cloaking themselves in patriotism, promoting this idea of 100% Americanism. If you're going to come to this country, which there should be a limited number of people coming, you better assimilate and do things the way we do. And this idea spread, the KKK, remember, was born in the South after the Civil War. The law says we have to treat blacks as equal. Well, no. We don't agree with the war. We didn't agree with losing the war. We don't agree with the new laws. So there were groups formed to go against that. This is the most prominent one. And this spread to the north. And again, remember, it wasn't just against blacks. It was against Jews. It was against Catholics. And it was against immigrants. And it led to the National Origins Act being passed in 1924. So there was enough of this sentiment that Congress passed a law that said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We will allow people into the country based on a 2% quota. So to put it in the simplest terms, let's say there were only 100. Of course, there was more. Let's say there's 100 Italian Americans living in America in 1925. Then we'll allow 2 Italians to immigrate to America. Now, before you think that's too harsh, first of all, in a world full of 190 some nation states, that's the world we live in, right? We talked about this before the break when we went through World War I and all of the policies that in the progressive era where people frown on American history and say this was wrong and that was wrong. and we posed a question to you: is it wrong for American leaders to look out for American interests? And a lot of you said no. That's what we elect them for. Because in a world full of 190 some competing nation states, isn't that what the American leaders are supposed to do? To work in such a way that they make things best or better for America. So in any nation, and not just America, nations have immigration laws. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean that they have immigration laws because they're prejudiced against other people. So let's start from there. But we also know what the sentiment here was, right? So there has to be, if you have a country with borders, that's the world we live in, then there has to be some organized, systematic way of accounting for the people in your country, right? And is there, do you just allow everybody that wants to come into your country to come in? By the way, this was all legal immigration. So while 100 years later, notice how history repeats itself, while 100 years later, we're dealing with this issue when it comes to immigration and a lot of the same, let's face it, there are some people have the same sentiment that it's not just about being legal or illegal for some people. It is about, unfortunately, maybe race does play a part of it. But don't we have to have some laws when it comes to people coming into the country? Can you tell me what one of the problems might be if we had no immigration laws and anybody who wanted to come to America could come? What could be a possible problem? Yeah.
Everybody would pretty much come over here. A lot of people, like too many people would be, and then you have.
What do you mean too many? Why would it be too many?
Cities. I guess it gets point of too many when like there's problems in like cities and stuff.
Okay,
Just, like,
so overcrowded.
and
Overcrowded might lead to what?
like crime and.
So would crime come from they're overcrowded, so then there's not enough resources for all the people? Okay, yeah.
Like starvation, because people wouldn't be able to. There'd be too many people for like jobs and stuff. So then like not everyone can get a job, and then people wouldn't be able to provide for their families.
Right. You understand? Because some people could go ahead, Barry. Disease? Yeah. Remember when we showed the video of Ellis Island? That was a big part of the process when people were getting off of the ships onto Ellis Island. A big part of the process was checking them for disease. Yeah. Yeah. Because if you look at this just from like a pure, some people just love everybody and their heart is in the right place. And they're like, we should just let anybody that wants to come to America come in. Well, in an ideal world, that might be great, but you have to have laws in order for your society to function and to be efficient and to be successful and prosperous. So anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but it is a big issue today, and it was a big issue then. You understand the 2% quota? We will allow as many people from a certain country based on the 2% of what we already have. This serves quite a number of purposes. One, like Derek said, governments have to make sure that there's enough resources for everybody, and one of those resources would be jobs, right? If more people come in, there's not enough jobs for everybody. More people are employed, leads to not enough resources for people living in cities, which could lead to crime because people don't have. So there's a lot of issues you have to think about, and primarily for a government, it would be jobs. Okay, now we turn the page to what else was going on in America. During this time we call the Roaring '20s, which is usually thought of as fast-paced, partying, happiness, a joyful time, people's lives were being made so much easier. Automobiles, washing machines, irons. Boy, you're looking at the clock and wondering. Yeah. Actually, second period, I looked over and I went, no, there is no way that I've been doing all this, and it's only, and what the bell almost rang, so I gotta get a battery. There was a movie in the 80s. I don't even remember the movie. But, you know, if you ever watch 80s movies with your parents, hopefully not too many. Not very many were kid worthy. But there was the one, I don't even remember what movie it was. It was a comedy, though. And the kids are all sitting in class, high school, and they're all waiting for the bell to ring. And it's like 1 minute before 3. Anybody ever see this? So they're waiting for the clock to go, and it goes backwards. That's what it felt like earlier. There is a rise of what we call fundamentalism in America in the 1920s. With all of this progress, not just in people with their jazz music and getting more money and having more recreation time and having these superstars, celebrities to idolize, and what we'll get to, having more cars, just so many things happening that made life more comfortable. There was also a fear in America of people losing sight of, like, hey, what's going on here? What's your whole purpose for being? David would say, my whole purpose for being is to glorify the Lord and enjoy him forever, right? Isn't that your whole purpose for being?
Yeah.
I knew you would agree. Right? So not that people 100% of the time before the 1920s were all saintly living for the Lord, but there was a big fear in the 20s that rose up because it seemed like people were becoming more and more, and it became more distinct. It became more. It was such a big change in lifestyle that Christian leaders, church leaders, became very concerned. Denominations, many different denominations, got together, held conferences to talk about and try to come up with strategies. How do we pull people back into the idea that these are Christian people, but when you're bombarded with all of the comforts of life, it's kind of hard to explain, because you're living in a world where I think, like I said, the technological changes that happen in your life, they're kind of like go from an iPhone 10 to an iPhone 13 or something. I mean, everything's you already got all the comforts. This was brand new to these people. By the way, having said that, I think I mentioned this before, with all of the comforts comes the natural proclivity of the sinful nature of man to not think you, quote unquote, need God. Am I right or wrong? Indulging yourself in all of these things that now your lifestyle. By the way, 100 years later, I know I mentioned to you this to you before, but you're growing up in a time where I believe it's the hardest ever to be a Christian. To not be distracted by worldly things. Think about it. It's constant. It's constant. You don't even really realize it. It's just natural part of life. That almost everything you do is geared around you. All the advertising is to make you feel better about you, to make you happy. Your cell phone's all designed for you. The video games. I know I've mentioned this to you before, if you haven't class before. The video games that I grew up with, like, hey, I'm competing with my friend. No. I watch kids play on video. The video game's all about making your own character. It's all about you. It's not like you're playing a game against some inanimate things. No, it's all self-indulgence, is it not? Am I wrong? Am I wrong? So how hard is it to really looking at it to really realize that, I'm not, to ground yourself in the fundamentals. What would that be in basketball, Jake? Fundamentals. Okay, layups, dribbling, right? Getting back to the basics. That's what the Christian leaders wanted to do in the 20s. Because along with all these comforts of life, we talked about what was going on in that progressive era, right? Well, from the progressive era, we have a lot of this coming into play in some churches with liberal theology. This isn't Bible class. Maybe I'll hand it over to Pastor Bell at this point. But in the 20s, a lot of pastors were concerned, Presbyterian pastors teaming with Baptists and other denominations to say, hey, what can we do to bring people back to the fundamentals? And you would think these things would never be lost. I mean, if you're a Christian, but people do lose sight of these things. It's easy to just say, I don't believe in the deity of Christ, which is hard to believe that someone said they're Christian and not believe in the deity of Christ, but I believe there's people out there that call themselves don't. How about vicarious atonement? You know what that means? That sounds like a big phrase. Vicarious means that someone's doing it. It's like you're living through that, right? Like Christ did that for you. Isn't that like a fundamental belief? Just this morning, there was a conversation that someone was telling in teacher devotions about. They had a conversation with another adult that's professing Christian. You got two Christians talking to each other, and the other person was a Christian. And somehow they were talking, and I don't know the whole story, but to make a long story short, the conversation got to, well, and I've had these conversations in my family circle and friend circle, like, there's an old saying, I know that I know that I know, like, you can't intellectually know everything or really, a whole lot of things, but if you know in your heart that you've given your life to Christ and you know you're saved, you just know it. If anybody's with me on that, I hope so. But, so these were two people that were Christians, and they were, one person that I heard the story from, I think was pretty confident. The other person was a pretty grounded Christian. And it got around to, like, you probably had these thoughts, like, how do I know I'm going to heaven? And you know what the person's answer was? This is from a Christian. What do you think their answer was? How do you know you're going to heaven? What would be your answer? Yeah.
Well, can I guess what the person said? By good works.
That they're a good person. Well, I think I've been a good person. Well, you say, but you'd be amazed how many people think that way still. Right? You've been taught your whole life. And some of you, Bible class, you've been at Heartland. A lot of the teachers are, is this Bible class? Okay, we heard it enough. No, you haven't. I haven't. I do this for fun sometimes, but just sitting at home. I go on and listen to different pastors, and I haven't heard enough. I don't have enough of it. You haven't had enough. You might think you had enough because maybe you're trying to resist it, but you haven't had enough. Maybe you think that you still think, after all this training and teaching, that when you imagine heaven, it's like, you're a good enough person to go to heaven. What? What? So Christ, who you say you worship and you follow, left the throne and came to live and be crucified and sacrificed for nothing? So that you being a good person, get to heaven? I didn't want to spend that much time on it, but am I right or wrong, at least? Isn't that a fundamental? The resurrection, the second coming. Anyway, there was a need, it felt, to go against this liberal modernist theology. And this battle was taking place in schools and denominations, causing splits among Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, just about every denomination. From the late 1800s into the early 1900s, a lot of turmoil and strife. I mean, we're still left with it today, but this was a big period of time because, again, tied to the progressive era, liberal theology. Yes, sir.
We've talked about like most religions, but what about the Amish?
What about?
Like,
I'm not an expert. But go ahead.
when did they see? You know, like talking about the Catholics and the Christians and Buddhism and stuff like that, but like the Amish just not get involved in anything pretty much.
A religion.
Okay, what's a type of religion?
Hold on.
Yeah, but like they're their own.
What were you
thing.
saying there? That you're telling me the
Amish.
Amish are Christian?
They're Christians.
Yes.
Well, yeah,
It's a culture. It's not a religion.
well, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's more accurate, but still, like, I don't know. You never really hear about them.
Yeah, why are they there? Where are they?
Why are they? I can't right. Yes, Andy.
I know that their core belief is that everything should be, well, not their core belief, but like everything should be as God made it. So like their only times that, like they have a few different things that they do, but like they're not tied to anywhere else besides like their place here.
Okay, Isaac, I see where your thought was coming from. This whole modernization of the
Yeah.
world, right? And the liberal theology and the Amish, who you're saying that they resist all of these changes, right? Did you have something, Pastor Bill?
I was just gonna say the modernists, I mean, in this debate, it's not simply that the modernists are people looking for a modern world. But they're denying those pure doctrines.
Right.
They deny the physical property of the They deny the Jesus before the virgin. They deny
I'm cutting off all my Amish.
There's some of my favorites.
Hopefully the video worked.
I know.
Sophomore sensation.
Bro, you like that behind the back I had? That was dirty. I got the ball and I'm just like. After the no look. But then they come down and I came up and one on a terrible.